Hello, and welcome to the Week 6 lecture on National Collective Memories of D-Day. D-Day was one of the most significant battles of World War II. Planning and preparation for the battle lasted for years. Negotiations regarding the timing and location of the assault were the subject of intense debate between Allied leaders, and the result of the battle was the successful establishment of a second front in Western Europe, which would draw German manpower and resources away from the Eastern Front. And the battle dramatically changed the war in Europe for all the Allied nations directly affected by the battle, not including China here because, other than a rippling effect, they weren't directly impacted by the event. But as such, each of these nations holds a distinct collective memory. Most hold similar sentiments, but Russia's collective memory of D-Day is markedly different from that of the United States, Great Britain, and France. America features D-Day as the centerpiece of the idea that the United States were the great liberators of Europe in the midst of the Good War. Images and stories of the heroic efforts at Normandy were widely disseminated across American media from the very days following the invasion itself. As you'll see in this week's readings, American presidents from Roosevelt through the current administration hold up D-Day as a symbol of American fortitude and righteousness. Great Britain has long remembered D-Day as the beginning of the end. Britain had endured the humiliation of Dunkirk and Crete, among other lost battles. And they'd survived the Battle of Britain. In their memory, D-Day marks the turning point that sent the war in the other direction, away from the homeland, and began the downfall of the Nazi Empire. France remembers D-Day with a mix of trauma for the civilian lives lost surrounding D-Day and the gratitude of being liberated from Nazi rule. In the Allied bombings that took place prior to the battle and in the weeks that followed as the Allies sought to advance inland, it's estimated that over 50,000 French civilians lost their lives. The vivid memory of that carnage is, of course, counterbalanced to a degree by the French memory of D-Day as essentially the end of the German occupation. Paris would be liberated by the end of August, and much of France was back in French control by the end of September 1944. While the French collective memory of D-Day is complicated by the loss of so many civilian lives, it's largely honored in a positive light. But Russia carries a collective memory of D-Day very different than these other nations. Prior to D-Day, the Soviet Union was desperate for intervention by the United States and Great Britain. From July 1941, Stalin had begged the United States and Great Britain to send forces to the front in Russia to assist the Red Army. Opening a second front in Western Europe would be Stalin's consistent demand in negotiations with his other Allied leaders. And from 1941 through 1944, the Soviets built up a good deal of resentment for how long it was taking for this to occur. However, this desperation is not reflected at all in Russia's current collective memory of D-Day. The post-war clash between the Soviet Union and Western powers for influence and control in Europe, which would come to be known as the Cold War, was fertile ground for the blossoming of resentment that had begun with the frustration over how long it took to launch Operation Overlord. And the Soviet Union and later Russia would significantly downplay the importance of D-Day. When news first broke across the Soviet Union that Overlord had been successfully executed, there were reports of revelers in Moscow restaurants and cheering Soviet soldiers firing shots into the air, and a general feeling that things would now be much easier for the Red Army. This was quickly replaced with an official Soviet stance through the news agency Pravda that would downplay the importance of the event. Pravda framed the success of Overlord as an assistance to the momentum of the Red Army, which was shouldering a majority of the conflict. This appropriation of victory by the Soviets continued throughout the Cold War, and really up until the fall of the Soviet Union and beyond. Modern Russia continues to downplay the importance of D-Day to the outcome of World War II. 2019 marked the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and even as representatives from nations gathered in northern France to commemorate the event, Russian officials were making statements that the impact of D-Day on the Allied victory was minimal, and that the Western highlighting of D-Day was an orchestrated effort to take credit away from the victory over Germany, achieved principally by the Soviet Union. Days before the anniversary, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Western powers of creating, quote, false interpretations of history with mystifications and pseudo-historical theories, all in an effort to take credit away from the Soviet Union. In July of 2019, a spokesman for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, stated that D-Day did not have a decisive impact on the war, and that its significance should not be exaggerated. Now, to be fair, for several decades following the war, the United States underplayed the importance of the Soviet efforts and sacrifice on the Eastern Front for the same ideological reasons that compelled the Soviets to downplay the importance of D-Day. However, the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and yet Russia continues to devalue the significance of D-Day and the massive impact that it had on the war in Europe. Though the saying goes that history is written by the victors, it's clear that even the victorious Allies continue to author contrasting narratives of World War II 8 decades later, and each of these narratives has a significant impact on collective memories of D-Day. Thank you, and be well.